Physiology of basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is a group of nuclei in the forebrain and upper part of brainstem underlying the cortical mantle. The group of nuclei are caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, subthalamic nucleus, and substantia nigra. Caudate nucleus and putamen form the corpus striatum. Putamen and globus pallidus form the lenticular nucleus. Globus pallidus consists of internal segment and external segment. Substantia nigra consists of pars reticulata and pars compacta. The connections of basal ganglia include both afferent connections and efferent connections. The afferent connections, all the afferents enter basal ganglia via the corpus striatum. They are from most of the cortex and thalamus. The afferents also received from raffimagnus nucleus and pedunculopontine region of brainstem. The first one is corticostriate projections. They originate from many areas of cortex, premotor area, somatosensory area 1 and supplementary motor cortex. Thalamostriate fibers. They arise from centromedian nucleus and they end on striatum. Raffistriatal projections. They are serotonergic fibers from the Raffi nucleus in reticular formation. Pedunculostriatal projections. They arise from pedunculopontine nucleus of the brainstem. Efferent connections of basal ganglia. The output from basal ganglia is through internal segment of globus pallidus and pars reticulata of substantia nigra. So first from the internal segment of globus pallidus, first via thalamic fasciculus to the ventrolateral and ventroanterior and centromedian nuclei of thalamus, which further projects to prefrontal and premotor cortex. The next one from internal segment of globus pallidus will be via ansa lenticularis. The fibers go to subthalamic nucleus, substantia nigra and red nucleus of midbrain and also the reticular formation of brainstem. Next one from the pars reticulata of substantia nigra to the first one is ventrolateral and ventroanterior nuclei of thalamus. The second is pedunculopontine nucleus, habenular commissure and superior colliculus. The output from internal segment of globus pallidus to thalamus is inhibitory, whereas from thalamus to cortex is excitatory. The efferents to red nucleus go to rubrospinal tract. Motor loop of basal ganglia. The connection between basal ganglia and cortex forms a motor loop. The various areas of cerebral cortex projects to striatum. The striatum further projects to internal segment of globus pallidus, then to thalamic nuclei and back to the cortex. There are three internuclear connections of basal ganglia. The first internuclear connection is dopaminergic nigrostriatal system from substantia nigra to the striatum. The second is GABAergic inhibitory projections, striatum to pars reticulata of substantia nigra, striatum to internal segment and external segment of globus pallidus, external segment of globus pallidus to subthalamic nucleus. So these are the three projections of GABAergic inhibitory projections. The third internuclear connection is excitatory glutaminergic projections from subthalamic nucleus, which projects to internal segment and external segment of globus pallidus as well as pars reticulata of substantia nigra. Neural pathways of basal ganglia. There are direct pathways and indirect pathways. So first, the direct pathway in basal ganglia, cerebral cortex to corpus striatum, which includes caudate and putamen, then to internal segment of globus pallidus, thalamus, motor cortex. The cortex then excites the striatum with the help of glutamate. The striatum inhibits internal segment of globus pallidus. Internal segment of globus pallidus inhibits the inhibition of thalamus via thalamic fasciculus. goes to ventroanterior and ventrolateral nuclei of thalamus. Impulses from the thalamus to prefrontal and premotor cortex, and the final effect will be disinhibition. This is about the direct pathway of basal ganglia. Indirect pathway, first from cortex to striatum to external segment of globus pallidus to subthalamic nucleus to internal segment of globus pallidus to thalamus to cortex. So in indirect pathway, the striatum first inhibits external segment of globus pallidus. Inhibition by external segment of globus pallidus on the subthalamic nucleus is removed. The subthalamic nucleus activates internal segment of globus pallidus. So stimulation of striatum activates internal segment of globus pallidus. The final effect of this indirect pathway is inhibition of thalamocortical fibers by the internal segment of globus pallidus. Nigostriatal projections have important effects on both pathways. Dopaminergic connections of pars compacta to the striatum has an excitatory effect on direct pathway and inhibitory effect on indirect pathway. In health, there is a balance between the two pathways. Alteration of either of them result in imbalance in the motor output. So basal ganglia disorders may have both hypokinetic and hyperkinetic movement disorders. Functions of basal ganglia. The basal ganglia performs a wide range of functions. The basal ganglia is involved in planning and programming of voluntary movements. The neurons of basal ganglia fire impulses even before the movement starts. Caudate loop is involved in planning of movements by direct pathway through the caudate nucleus. The basal ganglia controls muscle tone through inhibition of motor cortex and inhibitory medullary reticular formation. The pathway involved is cortex to striatum to globus pallidus to substantia nigra to medullary reticular formation to spinal cord via reticulospinal tract. In lesion of basal ganglia, there will be hypertonia since control of muscle tone is lost. The basal ganglia controls the limb movements. In diseases of basal ganglia, unpurposeful limb movements may appear. The basal ganglia controls automated associative limb movements like swinging of arms while walking. The putamen circuit by direct pathway through the putamen nucleus is involved in the control of subconscious movements. Timing the movements is also a role of basal ganglia. The basal ganglia exerts an inhibitory effect on spinal reflexes, which helps to regulate the posture. The somatic movements associated with emotions are controlled by basal ganglia. The basal ganglia provides muscle tone for skilled movements. The functions in motivated behavior. Caudate nucleus plays a role in cognition because of its connections with associative cortex. Lesion of caudate nucleus leads to deficits of performance-based learning. Because of the connection of basal ganglia with the reticular formation, the globus pallidus has a role in arousal mechanism. Lesion of head of caudate nucleus leads to dysarthric aphasia. Disorders of basal ganglia. The basal ganglia disorders are associated with movement disorders, which may be hyperkinetic movements or hypokinetic movements. Hyperkinetic movements such as rigidity, chorea, athetosis, balismus, rest tremors. Hypokinetic movements such as akinesia and bradykinesia. First is Parkinson's disease. It is also called paralysis agitans. This disease occurs due to destruction of nigostriatal dopaminergic neurons to putamen, which is mostly affected. The causes of Parkinsonism may be primary or idiopathic, or it may be due to complication of drugs such as phenothiazine. The Parkinsonism is characterized by Hyperkinetic features, hyperkinetic features such as lead pipe rigidity or cogwheel rigidity, resting tremors at 6 to 8 Hz frequency, hypokinesia, which means movements are weakened, and lack of initiation of movements, which result in akinesia and bradykinesia. Then the Parkinsonism is also characterized by lack of automated movements, mask-like face without any expressions. The gait observed in Parkinsonism is festinant or short shuffling gait, where the patient walks in an attitude like he is going to catch the center of gravity. Treatment of Parkinsonism. Treatment with L-DOPA rather than dopamine is advised, as it cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. Bromocriptine, which is a dopamine agonist, can also be used. Anticholinergics like atropine tries to reduce the acetylcholine levels in basal ganglia and regulate the ratio between the dopamine and acetylcholine. L-deprenyl drug can also be used. Dopamine agonist like bromocriptine is used. Transplantation of adrenal medulla in basal ganglia and implantation of fetal basal ganglia. These could be the possible treatments for Parkinsonism. The next disorder is chorea. Chorea is due to disease of caudate nucleus, which is characterized by rapid, irregular, involuntary movements which are of short duration. Chorea is seen in Huntington's disease, rheumatic fever in children, etc. The third disorder is athetosis. Athetosis is due to lesion in lenticular nucleus, which is characterized by continuous, slow, and twisting movements. The movements are warm like writhing movements of extremities like the fingers and wrist. The next type of disorder is hemibalism. Hemibalism is due to damage to subthalamic nucleus or due to hemorrhage in it. Hemibalism is characterized by spontaneous attacks of uncoordinated movements affecting the whole of opposite side of the body. The next disorder is Huntington's disease, which is a genetic disorder inherited as an autosomal dominant disease. There is damage to GABAergic neurons and cholinergic neurons of the striatum in Huntington's disease. So loss of GABAergic neurons leads to hyperkinetic movements. Early sign is a jerky trajectory of the hand when reaching to touch a spot, especially towards the end of the target. Later hyperkinetic coriform movements appear in Huntington's disease and they can incapacitate the patient. The speech becomes slurred and incomprehensible, and later dementia sets in and death happens in 10 to 15 years. And for Huntington's disease there is no effective treatment. Wilson's disease is also called hepatolenticular degeneration, which occurs due to accumulation of copper in brain and liver. Liver cirrhosis is also seen in Wilson's disease. In brain, the damage is more in lenticular nucleus, especially in putamen, and the symptoms of Parkinsonism are seen in case of Wilson's disease. Kernicterus is the final disorder of basal ganglia. Damage to globus pallidus following deposition of unconjugated bilirubin leads to kernicterus, which is usually seen in hemolytic disease of newborn. Symptoms of kernicterus may be rigidity, chorea, athetosis, mental deficiency, and it may lead to death.